In the late 9th century, the Frankish Empire stood at a crucial juncture in its history. Though nominally at its peak of territorial expansion, the empire faced growing internal fractures and an increasingly dangerous external threat from the north, the Vikings. The year 885 marked a turning point when these northern warriors launched one of their most ambitious campaigns against the heart of Francia. Paris in 885 was dramatically different from the sprawling metropolis we know today. The city was essentially an island fortress, concentrated primarily on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the Seine River. This geographic configuration made Paris both vulnerable and defensible. Vulnerable because it relied heavily on the river for commerce and communication, yet defensible because the island position created natural barriers against attackers. The city served as a critical checkpoint controlling river traffic and trade along the Seine, making it both strategically and economically vital to the Frankish realm. Daily life in Paris carried the tensions of a city preparing for war. The air was thick with the acrid smoke billowing from blacksmiths' forges, working overtime to produce weapons and armor. This industrial scent mingled with the more comforting aroma of fresh bread from the city's bakeries, creating a paradoxical atmosphere of both normalcy and impending danger. The soundscape of the city was dominated by church bells, which had transformed from markers of prayer times to urgent warning systems. These bells rang out with increasing frequency as scouts reported Viking movements upriver. From wooden and stone watchtowers along the city's perimeter, sentinels maintained constant vigilance, their eyes scanning the horizon for the distinctive dragon-headed prows of Viking longships. The tension was palpable throughout the population as rumors and reports of Viking raids elsewhere in Francia reached the capital. The political situation further complicated Paris's defense. The Frankish Empire was ruled by Emperor Charles the Fat, whose name would prove unfortunately prophetic regarding his military leadership. Despite holding nominal control over vast territories, Charles presided over an empire increasingly fragmented by internal rivalries, disputed succession claims, and regional power struggles. Local nobles, particularly in border regions, had begun establishing semi-autonomous power bases as central authority weakened. This political disunity would prove catastrophic when facing an organized external threat. Meanwhile, the Viking force approaching Paris represented one of the largest Scandinavian military expeditions ever assembled in Western Europe. Led by the cunning chieftain Siegfried, the Viking armada consisted of approximately 700 ships, carrying an estimated force of 30,000 warriors. To put this in perspective, most medieval armies rarely exceeded 10,000 men, making this Viking host exceptionally large and formidable. These were not merely raiders, but a proper invasion force with the potential to permanently alter the geopolitical landscape of Western Europe. The Viking army represented diverse Scandinavian origins, primarily Danish and Norwegian, but had coalesced under strong leadership with clear strategic objectives. They had evolved significantly from earlier Viking raids, which typically targeted isolated monasteries or small settlements. This force aimed to strike at the heart of Frankish power and potentially to establish permanent control over the Seine River Valley, one of Europe's most fertile and economically productive regions. The approaching confrontation at Paris would be shaped by these geographical, political, and military realities. The Frankish defenders found themselves isolated on their island city, defending not just Paris, but potentially the future of the empire itself. The Vikings, emboldened by previous successes and sensing Frankish weakness, saw an opportunity to deliver a potentially fatal blow to one of Europe's great powers. As November 885 approached, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic and consequential sieges of the early medieval period, a contest that would test the resilience of Parisian defenses against the fearsome reputation of the northern warriors. If you are passionate about epic battles from the Middle Ages and want to discover how the Vikings almost conquered Paris, leave your like and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel so you don't miss any of our historical adventures. The dramatic events of the Viking siege of Paris were shaped by remarkable individuals whose decisions, leadership qualities, and personal courage would determine the fate of the city and, ultimately, the Frankish Empire. Let us examine the main figures whose actions defined this pivotal historical moment. Count Odo emerged as the central heroic figure during the siege of Paris. Born around 860 into the influential Robertian family, Odo was the son of Robert the Strong, who had built a reputation fighting Vikings in the Loire Valley. Though relatively young when the siege began, only in his mid-20s, Odo demonstrated exceptional military acumen and inspirational leadership that belied his age. As the secular defender of Paris, Odo coordinated the city's military response with remarkable effectiveness. Contemporary accounts describe him as tireless, often personally manning the walls during critical Viking assaults. In one particularly famous episode, documented by the monk Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Odo led a dangerous mission through enemy lines to seek reinforcements when the situation grew desperate. After reaching Emperor Charles and pleading Paris's case, he fought his way back through the Viking encirclement to resume command of the defense, a feat that cemented his legendary status among Parisians. Odo's leadership style combined tactical intelligence with personal bravery. He understood the psychological importance of being visible to both defenders and attackers, often positioning himself at the most threatened sections of wall. Unlike many nobles of his era who led from the rear, Odo fought alongside common soldiers, building fierce loyalty among Paris's defenders. His ability to maintain morale during months of siege conditions, including food shortages, disease, and constant assault, proved as valuable as his military skills. The siege transformed Odo from a regional count into a figure of national importance. His successful defense of Paris against overwhelming odds would later serve as the foundation for his claim to the Frankish throne, which he ascended in 888 following Charles the Fat's deposition, a remarkable rise for a man who began the conflict as merely one of many Frankish nobles. Bishop Goslin represented the perfect embodiment of the fighting cleric in early medieval Europe. Already elderly when the siege began, contemporary sources suggest he was in his 60s, Goslin refused to abandon his flock despite opportunities to flee. As Paris's religious leader, he might have legitimately sought safety elsewhere, but instead chose to become a central figure in organizing the city's defense. Goslin's contribution went far beyond spiritual leadership. He transformed Paris's churches into militarized strongpoints, ordered the construction of defensive works, and most remarkably, personally took up arms to fight alongside secular defenders. Monastic chroniclers, themselves churchmen, recorded with evident admiration how Goslin wore armor over his ecclesiastical robes and wielded weapons against the pagan attackers. In their accounts, Goslin embodied the ideal of the church militant, defending Christianity not just through prayer, but with direct martial action. The bishop's technical contributions were equally important. He directed the strengthening of the Grand Pont and Petit Pont, the two bridges that connected the Ile de la Cité to the riverbanks, recognizing them as critical, vulnerable points. Under his supervision, churches contributed their treasuries to fund defensive preparations, and monks worked alongside craftsmen to forge weapons and repair fortifications. Tragically, Goslin's advanced age made him vulnerable to the harsh conditions of the siege. Contemporary accounts describe him growing progressively weaker as the months passed, yet refusing to relinquish his role. He died during the siege in April 886, a devastating blow to Parisian morale. However, his earlier preparations and the defensive system he helped establish continued to protect the city. His death transformed him from respected leader to martyr in the eyes of Paris's defenders, further hardening their resolve. The Viking leader Siegfried represented a new generation of Scandinavian military leaders who combined traditional Viking ferocity with sophisticated political calculation. Unlike earlier Viking chieftains who focused primarily on raiding and plunder, Siegfried approached the Paris campaign with complex strategic objectives that included territorial control, tribute extraction, and political manipulation of Frankish internal divisions. Siegfried's background remains somewhat obscure in historical records, though most scholars identify him as Danish. By 8085, he had established himself as a preeminent leader capable of unifying disparate Viking contingents under a centralized command. No small achievement, given the traditionally independent nature of Viking warbands. His authority was likely built on both martial reputation and demonstrated success in previous campaigns, possibly including earlier raids in England and northern Francia. As a military commander, Siegfried demonstrated impressive adaptation. When initial assaults on Paris failed, he implemented a sophisticated siege strategy using multiple approaches: attacks on the bridges, construction of siege engines, psychological warfare, and targeted raids on supply lines. Yet perhaps his most innovative approach was his use of diplomacy alongside military pressure. Throughout the siege, Siegfried alternated between fierce attacks and negotiation attempts, particularly targeting Bishop Goslin with offers designed to create divisions among the defenders. Contemporary Frankish chronicles, while naturally hostile to this pagan invader, nevertheless reveal grudging respect for Siegfried's intelligence. The monk Abo described him as cunning as a fox, in his ability to identify and exploit weaknesses. When frontal assaults proved costly, Siegfried adapted his tactics to minimize Viking casualties while maintaining pressure on the defenders. This strategic flexibility distinguished him from less sophisticated Viking leaders of earlier generations. Ultimately, Siegfried's approach to the Paris campaign revealed the evolution of Viking ambitions in Western Europe. No longer content with simple plunder, leaders like Siegfried sought lasting political influence and territorial control, goals that would soon lead to permanent Viking settlements throughout the region, including Normandy. Emperor Charles III, known to history as Charles the Fat, stands as the most controversial figure of the Paris siege. As ruler of the reunited Carolingian Empire, temporarily reassembling the territories of his grandfather Charlemagne, Charles possessed resources and authority that should have made him the decisive actor in Paris's defense. Instead, his delayed response and controversial handling of the crisis accelerated the decline of imperial authority in Western Europe. Born in 839, Charles had gradually accumulated titles and territories through a combination of inheritance and political opportunity rather than personal achievement. By 885, he ruled a vast empire stretching from northern Italy to the North Sea, making him theoretically the most powerful Christian ruler in Western Europe. However, this impressive imperial facade masked significant weaknesses: overextended resources, numerous internal challenges, and Charles's own limitations as a military leader. The emperor's physical condition may have contributed to his ineffective response. Contemporary sources describe him as suffering from health problems that limited his mobility, possibly epilepsy or a degenerative condition. These physical challenges, combined with the logistical difficulties of moving a large imperial army across vast distances, help explain but do not excuse his failure to promptly relieve Paris. When Charles finally arrived with his army in October 886, nearly a year after the siege began, his choices proved deeply controversial. Rather than engaging the Viking force in decisive battle as Parisians expected, he negotiated a settlement that many viewed as humiliating. In exchange for lifting the siege, Charles agreed to pay the Vikings £700 of silver and, most disappointingly to contemporaries, granted them permission to ravage Burgundy instead, essentially sacrificing one part of his realm to save another. This decision revealed both pragmatic calculation and significant weakness. Charles likely recognized his army's limitations against the battle-hardened Vikings, particularly in the unfavorable terrain around Paris. However, by effectively redirecting the Viking army against his own territories, he undermined his fundamental responsibility as emperor, the protection of all Christian lands under his rule. The political consequences were swift and severe. Charles's handling of the Paris siege became a powerful symbol of imperial inadequacy, contributing directly to his deposition in 887, just 1 year later. The contrast between the emperor's compromising approach and the heroic resistance of local leaders like Odo and Goslin accelerated the decentralization of power in Francia, as regional nobles concluded they must rely on their own resources rather than imperial protection. Charles died shortly after his deposition in January 888. His death marked the effective end of the unified Carolingian Empire as different regions selected their own rulers, including Odo in West Francia. The empire Charlemagne had built a century earlier fragmented permanently, reconfiguring the political landscape of Western Europe for centuries to come. Through these four key figures, the heroic defender, the warrior bishop, the adaptive invader, and the failing emperor, we can understand not just the dramatic events of the Paris siege itself, but its lasting significance in reshaping political realities and power structures throughout medieval Europe. The morning of November 24th, 885, dawned over Paris with an ominous transformation of the Seine River. What had for centuries been a lifeline of commerce and communication for the Paris basin suddenly became a highway for invaders. The first indicators reached the city not through sight, but sound. The rhythmic splash of hundreds of oars cutting through the frigid waters, creating an acoustic warning that traveled faster than the vessels themselves. From the watchtowers of the Grand Pont and Petit Pont, the two vital bridges that connected the island city to the mainland, sentinels strained their eyes eastward. The rising sun eventually illuminated what many Parisians had dreaded for years: a vast armada of Viking longships appearing around the river bend. The fleet stretched so far that observers couldn't see its end, creating what contemporary chroniclers described as a floating forest of masts and sails that seemed to transform the Seine itself into solid ground. The psychological impact of this sight cannot be overstated. Most Parisians had heard tales of Viking raids throughout Francia, but few had witnessed such a concentration of northern power. The longship's distinctive design, shallow-drafted vessels with high, curved prows, often carved into fearsome dragon heads or other mythological beasts, was intentionally intimidating. These vessels, between 60 and 80 feet long, approached in battle formation, their shields lining the gunwales, creating colorful but menacing walls along both sides of each ship. The monk abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who witnessed the siege firsthand and later chronicled it in his poem Bella Parisiacae Urbis, Wars of the City of Paris, described the moment with a mixture of fear and awe. The waters were hidden beneath the ships. The shores could not contain all the vessels, and the river, blocked by ships, seemed no longer a river. Modern historians estimate that the total Viking fleet numbered around 700 ships, an enormous concentration of naval power by medieval standards. As the fleet drew closer, Parisians could make out the war gear and weaponry of the warriors aboard. Each longship carried between 40 and 60 men, primarily fighters rather than rowers, as Viking crews typically performed both functions. The warriors bore a variety of weapons: Danish axes with their distinctive long handles, spears, swords, and round shields painted in bold colors and patterns. Many wore mail shirts that glinted in the winter sun, while leaders and champions were distinguished by gilded helmet decorations or colorful cloaks. The approach was deliberately paced and organized, not the chaotic rush of raiders, but the measured advance of an invasion force. Siegfried had positioned his most impressive ships at the vanguard, their ornately carved prows and the banners of prominent jarls, chieftains, clearly visible. This was not merely a tactical choice, but a psychological one, designed to overwhelm defenders with the sheer scale and organization of the Viking host. From the walls of Paris, Count Odo and Bishop Goslin observed the approach with grim determination. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering supplies, strengthening fortifications, and training militia to supplement the professional garrison. Now, facing the reality of the Viking armada, they moved quickly to implement their defense plan. The immediate concern was the protection of the two bridges, the Grand Pont, Great Bridge, to the north, and the Petit Pont, Small Bridge, to the south. These structures were crucial to Paris's defense strategy, as they were the only fixed crossings over the Seine and prevented the Vikings from easily surrounding the island city. Both bridges had been reinforced with wooden towers at each end, manned by archers and equipped with primitive artillery, catapults and ballistae that could target ships attempting to pass beneath. As the Viking fleet approached within bowshot, tension built on both sides. The city's bells rang frantically, calling all able-bodied men to their defense positions. Priests led prayers in churches across the Ile de la Cité, while women and children carried water, arrows and stones to the walls. The civilian population, swollen by refugees who had fled smaller settlements along the Seine, crowded into churches seeking divine protection or gathered in homes to await news of the confrontation. The first Viking ships drew to a halt beyond arrow range, and a smaller vessel detached from the fleet. It carried a small party flying a flag of truce. Siegfried had chosen to begin with diplomacy rather than immediate assault. This approach revealed the Viking leader's sophistication. Rather than relying solely on brute force, he attempted to exploit potential divisions among the defenders or secure the city's surrender without costly fighting. The negotiation party, led by Siegfried himself, was met at the northern end of the Grand Pont by Count Odo and Bishop Goslin. The Viking leader, dressed in finery that demonstrated both his wealth and status, presented his terms. Paris could surrender, pay an enormous tribute, and grant the Viking fleet free passage upriver to raid Burgundy or face complete destruction. Siegfried emphasized his overwhelming numerical advantage and recounted the fate of other cities that had resisted Viking forces. Bishop Goslin, speaking for the defenders, delivered an uncompromising response that would become legendary in Parisian history. "This city has been entrusted to us by our emperor, and we will defend it to our last breath. Paris has withstood enemies before, and will do so again." Negotiations collapsed quickly, with both sides returning to their forces to prepare for battle. As the Viking embassy returned to their fleet, Siegfried ordered his forces to establish camp on both banks of the Seine, demonstrating his intention to conduct a prolonged siege rather than a single assault. On the northern right bank shore, Vikings began constructing a fortified encampment near what is now Montmartre, while a smaller force established positions on the southern left bank. The methodical way they set about this task, digging defensive ditches, erecting palisades and establishing command tents, indicated that this was a professional army prepared for an extended campaign, not merely a raiding party. By nightfall on that first day, the full scale of the challenge facing Paris had become clear to defenders and civilians alike. The Viking force, estimated at around 30,000 warriors, vastly outnumbered the approximately 200 professional soldiers of the garrison, supplemented by perhaps 1,000–2,000 militia and able-bodied civilians. The city's stores, while substantial thanks to careful preparation, would be stretched by the refugee population. and the likelihood of swift imperial relief seemed remote, given Emperor Charles's distant location and the coming winter conditions that would complicate any large-scale military movement. As darkness fell over the Seine Valley, bonfires lit up the Viking encampments on both shores, their reflections dancing on the river's surface. From Paris's walls, the sight must have been both mesmerizing and terrifying, a visual representation of the stranglehold now placed around the city. Inside the city, Odo and Goslin gathered their lieutenants to plan their resistance, knowing that the morning would likely bring the first assault and begin what would prove to be one of the most significant sieges in early medieval European history. The Parisians, isolated on their island fortress and surrounded by an enemy of unprecedented size, faced a stark reality. Survival would depend on their fortifications, their leadership, and their will to resist against seemingly impossible odds. The siege of Paris had begun, and with it, a contest that would reshape the political landscape of Francia and determine the future course of Viking activity in Western Europe. Are you impressed by the scale of this historic conflict? Tell us in the comments, do you think Paris could withstand an attack of this magnitude? Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel to discover the outcome of this epic story. The Siege of Paris witnessed an extraordinary display of military innovation and tactical warfare from both sides. The Vikings, renowned for their maritime prowess, employed sophisticated siege techniques that went far beyond their traditional raid and plunder tactics. Their primary strategy focused on destroying the two bridges that connected the island city to the mainland, as these bridges were crucial checkpoints controlling river traffic and trade. The Viking forces deployed floating rams, ingeniously constructed on their longships, to batter the city walls and bridge foundations. These rams, protected by wooden roofs covered in fresh animal hides to resist fire, represented some of the most advanced siege technology of the period. The attackers also made extensive use of incendiary arrows, creating a terrifying spectacle as hundreds of flaming projectiles arced through the sky, threatening to set the city's wooden structures ablaze. Under cover of darkness, Viking warriors frequently attempted to scale the city walls using ropes and wooden ladders. These night raids were particularly dangerous for the defenders, as the darkness made it difficult to anticipate where the next attack would come from. The Vikings also constructed siege towers, though moving these massive structures across the marshy riverbanks proved challenging. The Frankish defenders, under the leadership of Count Odo and Bishop Goslin, responded with equally sophisticated defensive measures. They significantly reinforced the bridge towers with additional stonework and wooden reinforcements. The defenders positioned large stones and wooden beams at strategic points along the walls, ready to be dropped on attacking forces. One of the Franks' most effective defensive tactics was the use of boiling water and heated oil, which they poured from the battlements onto the Viking attackers below. This proved particularly devastating against warriors attempting to scale the walls or operate battering rams. The defenders also employed ballistas and catapults with remarkable effectiveness, using these weapons to sink several Viking ships and break up concentrated attacks. Perhaps most daringly, the Frankish defenders conducted regular night sorties. Small groups of warriors would slip out of the city under cover of darkness to sabotage Viking siege equipment and burn their supply camps. These raids, while extremely dangerous, proved crucial in disrupting the Viking siege preparations and maintaining defender morale. The Franks also made innovative use of the river itself, constructing underwater obstacles to damage Viking ships and prevent them from maneuvering effectively near the city walls. They strategically positioned chains across certain sections of the Seine, creating dangerous obstacles for the Viking longships, especially during rapid river currents. These complex military engagements demonstrated a level of sophistication that went well beyond the common perception of medieval warfare. Both sides showed remarkable adaptability, constantly adjusting their tactics in response to their opponents' strategies. The siege became a testament to medieval military engineering and tactical innovation, influencing fortress design and siege warfare for generations to come. The Siege of Paris in 885, Cheat 86, stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of urban resistance. For 11 grueling months, the citizens of Paris demonstrated extraordinary resilience against overwhelming odds, with the Vikings outnumbering the defenders by nearly 10-1. The harsh winter of 885-886 proved to be both a blessing and a curse for the defenders. While the freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall made manning the walls extraordinarily difficult, these same conditions wreaked havoc on the Viking encampment. The Seine partially froze, trapping many Norse vessels in ice and severely limiting their mobility. The Vikings, accustomed to shorter raids, found themselves ill-prepared for a prolonged winter siege. Disease became a merciless enemy to both sides. In the Viking camp, dysentery spread rapidly through the ranks, exacerbated by poor sanitation and crowded conditions. The cold and wet conditions led to respiratory infections, while wounds easily became infected in the unsanitary environment. The Norse warriors, who had expected a swift victory, found their numbers dwindling not from combat, but from illness. Inside Paris, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Food supplies, initially adequate for a short siege, began to dwindle alarmingly. The defenders implemented strict rationing, but by midwinter, they were reduced to eating horses, cats, and even rats. The wealthy shared their private stores, and the church opened its granaries, but hunger became a constant companion for every Parisian. The psychological toll was perhaps even more challenging than the physical hardships. The constant state of alertness required of the defenders led to extreme exhaustion. Count Odo and Bishop Goslin maintained morale through personal example, fighting alongside common soldiers and sharing in their privations. Religious services continued daily, providing spiritual comfort and a sense of routine in the chaos of siege. Small acts of heroism became commonplace. When a section of the wall was breached in January, civilians joined soldiers in the desperate fight to plug the gap, using furniture and even their own bodies as barriers, while masons worked frantically to repair the damage. Women and children participated in the defense, carrying water, tending to the wounded, and helping to maintain the weapons and defenses. In February, Count Odo undertook a perilous journey, slipping through the Viking lines to seek reinforcements from the emperor. His return weeks later, fighting through enemy lines to re-enter the city, became legendary. This act not only brought promise of relief, but also gave the defenders renewed hope and determination. The defenders also faced the challenge of maintaining their military equipment. The constant combat led to significant wear on weapons and armor. The city's blacksmiths worked tirelessly, repairing damaged equipment and fashioning new weapons from whatever materials were available. Even church bells were melted down to create new weapons when metal became scarce. Perhaps most remarkably, the Parisians maintained their unity throughout the ordeal. Despite class differences, hunger, and exhaustion, there were no recorded instances of civil unrest or attempts to surrender. This social cohesion, almost unprecedented in siege warfare of the period, proved crucial to their survival. By the time the siege entered its final months, Paris had been transformed. Every citizen had become a defender, every building a fortress, every resource carefully managed for survival. The siege had forged a new identity for Paris and its people, establishing a tradition of resistance that would influence French culture for centuries to come. The heroic resistance of Paris during these months would later be celebrated in contemporary chronicles and poems, most notably in Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés' epic Bella Parisiacae Urbis, Wars of the City of Paris. This resistance became a defining moment in French history, demonstrating how determination, leadership, and unity could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The arrival of Emperor Charles the Fat in October 886, after nearly a year of siege, should have been Paris's moment of triumph. Instead, it became one of the most controversial episodes in medieval French history, marking a turning point that would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. When Charles finally appeared with his imperial army, the defenders of Paris, who had endured unimaginable hardships, expected a decisive battle that would crush the Viking forces and become the stuff of legends. The size of Charles's army was considerable, and combined with the city's defenders, they held a strong tactical advantage against the weather-worn and disease-ravaged Norse invaders. However, what followed shocked contemporaries and continues to puzzle historians. Rather than engaging the Vikings in battle, Charles the Fat chose the path of negotiation. In a decision that would forever tarnish his reputation, he agreed to pay the Vikings a massive Danegeld of 700 pounds of silver. This amount was staggering for the time, enough to buy several thousand horses or feed a small city for a year. The payment essentially rewarded the Vikings for their aggression and validated their siege strategy. Even more controversially, Charles granted the Vikings permission to sail up the Seine and plunder Burgundy, a region of his own empire. This betrayal of his own subjects was particularly galling because Burgundy had remained loyal to him throughout his reign. The emperor essentially sacrificed one region to save another, a decision that demonstrated political expediency at its most cynical. The reaction to Charles's decision was immediate and visceral. The defenders of Paris, who had sacrificed so much during the siege, were outraged. Count Odo, who had personally led many of the most dangerous defensive actions, refused to acknowledge the agreement. In a display of defiance that would later contribute to his own rise to power, he denied the Vikings passage upriver, forcing them to drag their ships around the city by land. A humiliating and laborious process that demonstrated the hollowness of Charles's authority. Contemporary chroniclers were scathing in their criticism. Abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who witnessed the events firsthand, wrote that Charles had bought shame with gold. The emperor's decision was seen not just as a tactical mistake, but as a moral failure. A betrayal of the very principles of kingship and protection that legitimized Carolingian rule. The political consequences were far-reaching. Charles's handling of the siege became a symbol of Carolingian decay and incompetence. The contrast between the heroic resistance of Paris and the emperor's weak response could not have been starker. Noble families throughout the empire began to question whether the Carolingian dynasty still possessed the strength and wisdom to rule. This loss of confidence proved fatal to Charles's reign. In 887, just a year after the siege's resolution, a coalition of noble families forced his abdication. The speed of his fall from power demonstrates how completely the Paris debacle had undermined his authority. Charles the Fat became Charles the Deposed, dying in poverty in January 888. The vacuum created by Charles's failure accelerated the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. Count Odo, whose heroic defense of Paris stood in stark contrast to the emperor's cowardice, was elected King of West Francia, marking the first time a non-Carolingian had held this title. This transition signaled the end of Carolingian monopoly on royal power and the beginning of a new political era in Western Europe. The controversial end to the Siege of Paris thus served as a catalyst for fundamental changes in medieval European politics. It demonstrated that effective local leadership could trump traditional royal authority, setting precedents for the feudal power structures that would dominate European society for centuries to come. The episode remains a powerful reminder that sometimes the manner in which a conflict ends can have far greater historical significance than the fighting itself. The Siege of Paris in 885–886 left an indelible mark on European history, fundamentally reshaping military architecture, political structures, and cultural identity in ways that would resonate through the centuries. Its impact extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the conflict, creating ripples that would influence European society for generations to come. Paris emerged from the siege, transformed in both physical presence and symbolic significance. The city's successful resistance against overwhelming odds established it as a powerful symbol of resilience and determination. This enhanced status accelerated Paris's development from a relatively modest river trading post into one of medieval Europe's most important cities. The siege proved that Paris could serve as a bulwark against invasion, cementing its strategic importance and attracting increased settlement and investment. The political consequences were equally profound. Count Odo's elevation from local defender to King of West Francia marked a revolutionary change in medieval power structures. His rise represented the first major crack in Carolingian dynastic authority, demonstrating that martial prowess and effective leadership could trump hereditary claims to power. Odo's coronation in 888 established a new principle: that kings could be made by merit rather than solely by birth, influencing European political thought for centuries. The siege exposed critical weaknesses in the Carolingian system of governance. The empire's inability to respond quickly to the Viking threat, coupled with Charles the Fat's controversial handling of the crisis, accelerated the dynasty's decline. This political transformation gave rise to more localized power structures, contributing to the development of feudalism as the dominant political system in medieval Europe. Military architecture underwent a revolution in response to the siege's lessons. The effectiveness of Paris's defenses, particularly its bridges and riverside fortifications, influenced castle and city design throughout Europe. Engineers and architects began incorporating similar defensive features into their designs, leading to more sophisticated urban fortifications. The concept of river-based defenses became particularly influential, with many cities strengthening their riverside fortifications following Paris's example. The siege also had lasting effects on military organization and urban defense strategies. Cities throughout Europe began establishing permanent defensive forces and maintaining better-equipped arsenals. The Parisian example of civilian participation in defense led to more organized urban militias and better integration between civilian and military aspects of city defense. Culturally, the siege entered the medieval imagination as an epic of resistance and heroism. Contemporary accounts, particularly Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés' poem, established a template for siege narratives that would influence medieval literature for generations. The event became a cornerstone of French national identity, repeatedly invoked during later crises as an example of successful resistance against foreign invaders. The siege also influenced religious architecture and organization. The role of Bishop Goslin in the defense led to a re-evaluation of ecclesiastical architecture, with many churches being designed or modified to serve defensive purposes as well as religious ones. This dual-purpose architectural style became a common feature of medieval religious buildings, particularly in frontier regions. Economic changes followed as well. The siege demonstrated the importance of maintaining substantial food stores and military supplies, leading to changes in urban planning and storage practices. Cities began maintaining larger granaries and arsenals, while trading networks were reorganized to ensure better supply lines during crises. The Viking strategy during the siege also led to long-term changes in European defensive policies. The recognition that Vikings could mount sophisticated, long-term military operations rather than just raids led to more comprehensive defensive strategies along Europe's rivers and coasts. This included the establishment of new fortified towns and the improvement of communication networks between settlements. Perhaps most significantly, the siege marked a crucial point in the evolution of European warfare from early medieval to high medieval practices. The sophisticated combination of siege warfare, river-based operations, and urban defense presaged the complex military operations that would characterize later medieval warfare. In the broader sweep of history, the Siege of Paris stands as a pivotal moment, when the old order of Carolingian Europe began to give way to the feudal system that would define the High Middle Ages. Its legacy can be traced in everything from military architecture to political theory, from urban planning to national mythology, making it one of the most consequential events of the early medieval period. If you were impressed by this epic battle that changed the course of European history, be sure to like the video, share with your friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel.